What's up, everyone? Good morning. I figured this would probably be a better way for me to get the information across to you than kind of having the madness go around me. So I'm going to give us our next section, the study guide, and try to streamline things as good as possible. My goal time is under 15 minutes here, okay? So just to kind of present everything as kind of like this next stage of our history here. So let me share our screen. I'll bring up and show to you guys the study guide section that we're looking at here, which is section 3. And a lot of this moment in time is built upon these rapid changes, as we talked about yesterday, that Japan underwent after it's discovered that it's really backwards. So when Commodore Perry goes into Edo Bay and the Japanese are like way behind the times, they hit that kind of cultural fast forward button, kind of civilizational steroid they inject, and they try to make this gigantic leap forward in a short amount of time. And as part of that rapid growth comes this desire for conquest. Conquest in the sense that they wanted to go find colonies, they wanted to go have natural resources, of which Japan did not have much. So Japan starts playing this imperialism game and starts attacking its neighbors. They invade Korea and conquer Korea, which then leads them to an attack on northern China here, which is a place we'll come back to in just a minute that's called Manchuria. So Manchuria is this northeastern corner of China that the Japanese will eventually take over. And then, of course, there's the eventual war with Russia that the Japanese will win because on land they fight to a standstill. At sea they of course win by annihilating the Russian fleets. But Japan now suddenly finds itself as a regional power and an imperial power because it now has colonies. And it's this big power shift that's occurring in the region that wasn't quite appreciated at the time. But as we will see as events unfold, as I present them today, many, many things are going to start to change as the Japanese continue to grow and to kind of feed on these lands as this war expands farther and farther and farther. Okay. Now, kind of inevitably, the word that is talked about with Japan at this point in time, and this point in time is late 1920s, early 1930s, is the term militarism. Okay. I'll take a look. We can bring this up here if you need to. Of course, since this will be a video, you can pause it. Militarism, the belief or desire of a government or people that a country should maintain a strong military capability and be prepared to use it aggressively to defend or promote national interests. Okay. On a certain level, militarism doesn't sound like too wild or too bad, although you do see it as a derogatory term. Like, it's not a good thing. On a surface, it's like, okay, you have a military to defend your national interests, right? But the idea of militarism is this kind of aggrandizement, this adulation, this kind of hero making of the military. To give us a sense and an appreciation, at least in the United States today, and pretty much almost every modern state, every country is going to have a military of some form or another. The military, though, is subservient to the representative government. So, like, for example, like President Biden, President of the United States, in addition to being President of the United States, he's the commander in chief. So he holds a military role. Okay? He is the leader as commander in chief of the entire United States military, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines. Okay? The military is subservient to the civilian government in the United States. So whatever the politicians want the military to do, the military has to follow suit. And that's a very critical and very important thing for the safety of democracy and for the safety of our country. If you had, let's say like in France, when Napoleon takes power, he like starts operating on his own. He's a military figure, right? But he basically stops following whatever the government tells him to do. And then long story short, Napoleon stages a coup, and then he rises to preeminence, overthrows the government, becomes the emperor. So the idea of a military in today's modern world is a military that needs to be held accountable by the government of the country that it's inside of. What happens with militarism here in Japan is that the military basically becomes detached from that accountability. It starts basically operating on its own. And the military becomes so powerful that it, instead of like Japanese political leaders, will start deciding Japanese policy. Okay, there's an old phrase that's called the tail wagging the dog. That the dog should wag its own tail. The dog is the entity with the brain that determines what the tail is supposed to do. But in this instance here, the tail is the one that's wagging, and the dog has no control over it. The dog is the Japanese government that should control its own military, its tail. But the reverse will wind up being true when the military is the one that's wagging the government, it's wagging the dog. Okay? And this is all basically going to be due in part to the fact that the Japanese military, from the moment they invade Korea and the First Sino-Japanese War and the Russo-Japanese War, the military has all of these overwhelming successes, undefeated. Okay? And it starts to build this momentum that, hey, maybe this military is invincible, and the people back home are being told how great the military is, and kids are going to school and they're being inundated with their teachers about the greatness of Japan and Japan's like feudal past with the samurai and Bushido and the shoguns, and you should join the military to fight for the greatness of Japan. And kids would basically graduate high school or drop out of high school and then immediately go and enlist in the military. And the military became this thing that created this momentum all of its own. And it was something you could not criticize. It was something that was unaccountable and will start doing things that if you had like a calm, cool government deliberating over it, that government would never attack all of these countries that Japan is about to attack. Okay? There's even one very famous incident in, I believe, the very early 1930s, that a group of Navy cadets, young kids, 18, 19 years old, will storm the prime minister's palace and will kill the prime minister of Japan. And there was like not this upwelling of rage inside of Japan. It's more so this upwelling of support. There was a petition with hundreds of thousands of signatures on it, basically saying, be lenient on these kids. Like, they made a mistake. They were doing it for the good of Japan. And then these kids go to trial, like they killed the prime minister. They go to trial and they're basically given a slap on the wrist. So the military and militarism, this glorification of the military, becomes this very unstable and dangerous thing. And ultimately, that Japanese military, after it builds up enough strength, will unleash a war against China. And this is where our story, where we left off China the other day, now becomes intertwined. Chiang Kai-shek, at this point in time, the leader of the Kuomintang, is cornering Mao Zedong and the communists in northern China. The Long March is at its conclusion, where the communists are basically decimated. And just as Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang are going to maneuver in and annihilate the remaining communists, Japan invades the country. Okay? And this Japanese invasion, which is known formally as the Second Sino-Japanese War, is more or less considered by many historians to be the true start of World War II. We usually in the West think World War II starts September 1st, 1939, when Germany invades Poland. In the instance here of what's going to be happening in Japan, more likely started in 1934. Some could argue 1931 with an earlier incident. Okay? But this is this war that's going to consume this part of the world. Okay? Now, Chiang Kai-shek finds himself in a situation fighting this basically Japanese state. The Japanese set up this puppet state called Manchukuo in the north. They, in fact, actually bring back the remaining surviving Qing emperor, install him in power. And the Japanese use this northern part called Manchuria, which is filled with natural resources and raw materials, as their base of operation to launch down and to descend upon China proper, the Kuomintang-held areas of China. And Chiang Kai-shek pretty quickly finds himself outnumbered, not necessarily outnumbered, on the battlefield he's outnumbered, but certainly outgunned and outmatched. And Chiang Kai-shek, as a simplification of his strategy, he realizes the only way to go and to defeat the Imperial Japanese army is to set a trap for it. That he needs to set this trap because he needs foreign help to come in to defeat the Japanese. So what Chiang Kai-shek will do, he will set this trap at this extremely important port city called Shanghai, which was the second largest city in China at the time. It was next to Beijing. It was a major commercial center. And it's in Shanghai that there's a huge amount of foreign citizens, and a lot of them are European citizens. There's also a lot of European businesses and European interests in Shanghai. So Chiang Kai-shek believes that if he sets this like kind of bait battle, see if you can draw the Japanese fighting inside of Shanghai, not only will you bog the Japanese down in this street-to-street, house-by-house brutal fighting, but also Chiang Kai-shek kind of thinks in a dark way, European property or Western property more broadly, is going to be destroyed. So Westerners will want to defend their property. Maybe some Westerners get killed too, and that will enrage those countries back home against the Japanese. Chiang Kai-shek had been receiving military aid and training from, strangely, the Germans and also from some European forces at this point in time and the United States. So he has a pretty good army that he's going to throw in to defend Shanghai. And he feels as though if he can pull the Japanese in here, he can maybe bring in more Western aid. Maybe he can even defeat the Japanese, of course. So the Japanese take the bait here. And if you are a history buff, if you care about these stories more in depth, there is a very good animated YouTube series. It's called Armchair Historian. I will link this and I will drop this into our chat in class today if you are interested in checking it out. It's called Chinese Stalingrad, the Battle of Shanghai. But this bait battle in Shanghai, the Japanese take the bait, they launch a combined naval assault, they sail up the river, they have forces moving in over land, and it becomes pretty quickly a slog. But after 3 months of extreme fighting in Shanghai, Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang forces are beaten back. They are forced to withdraw from the city after suffering horrific casualties. And Chiang Kai-shek and his army, having thrown the cream of the crop in his army, the best equipment, the best trained soldiers, he loses them in Shanghai. He didn't know how actually good the Japanese were at fighting. So if you are going, you're throwing all of your eggs into one basket, and that basket gets crushed, like there's nothing really else left then. So the people and the remnants of the survivors of the fighting in Shanghai, not only the soldiers that survived, but any civilians that could get out of town as fast as possible, they flee away from the Japanese lines as quickly as they can. Okay? Now, the international community is mostly, I don't want to say indifferent here, but at this point in time, in this Battle of Shanghai and this Second Sino-Japanese War, back in Europe and especially back in the United States, the Great Depression's going on. Millions are out of work. Okay? If you're in a country like Britain or France, like you're dealing with all sorts of problems with Hitler and appeasement and all sorts of issues going on inside of Europe, right? People didn't have the hunger or the desire for a war. People weren't willing to go and say, hey, let's enlist, let's go fight to defend Chiang Kai-shek and the Chinese. Right? People felt bad, but it wasn't something that European nations or the United States was willing to go and to fight for at this point in time. Subsequent events will cause a greater motivation and a greater anti-Japanese resentment. One very, very stunning photograph, and I will forewarn you, this is not a nice photograph, is going to be taken in the aftermath of one of these bombings that the Japanese Air Force will unleash on this railway station south of Shanghai. And of course, there's news reports going on about all these awful things happening, all these civilians dying. But as the old newspaper saying goes, if it bleeds, it leads. If there's violence, it's going to get people's attention. So forewarning, you're not seeing anything gruesome or grisly per se, but what will be coined as Bloody Saturday is this photo of a Chinese baby. The gender and who it was never actually ascertained. This infant, which is, if he's sitting, it's probably like 7 months old, right? Is at this railway station, gets hit by a Japanese bomb. His mom is killed. His mom's body was just off camera shot here, sitting there. And you can see the horrific raw emotion of what's going on amidst all of the desolation of what was occurring inside of Japan, right? This photo is one of like the most shocking photos, not only of this era, but of kind of all time. This is something that kind of started to wake up the rest of the world to the severe danger and barbarity in a lot of ways of what the Japanese were bringing about inside of Shanghai and against the Chinese. Okay. Now, where I'm going to leave off with our video here, because I will be giving you guys a reading and some information to look up and to check out, is that right after the fall of Shanghai and the brutality and the violence there, many of the survivors will flee inland to seek refuge at the then capital city of China, which was called back then Nanking. It's called Nanjing today, right? So this was the Kuomintang capital. This was where Chiang Kai-shek's government was based. Once Shanghai fell and all the defenders are essentially defeated, people fall back on Nanking, but Nanking didn't necessarily have the best defenses because, again, the best defenders were sent to fight in Shanghai. So Nanking finds itself relatively undefended as the Japanese army is hot on the heels of those retreating forces with this aim at attacking and defeating the capital city of Kuomintang, China. Caught in the mix are going to be not only the small remnant defenders of Nanking, but also the massive civilian population in the city. And one thing that's especially important to know, whether it's going to be the picture you guys had just seen or what's going to be happening in Nanking, is that this war, whether we call it the Second Sino-Japanese War or the Second World War, this war will target in many, many ways civilian populations. World War I, for the most part, soldiers killing soldiers, right? There was a sense of fairness there. Second World War, it's this indiscriminate killing of civilians, people who had not taken up arms, people who were innocent in these struggles, and you will have this specific targeting by militaries against them. So as perhaps a last image here to set in your mind perhaps what to expect at this infamous event known as the Rape of Nanking, the Nanking Massacre, okay, you will see the eventual butchering and the stacking up of bodies of what is probably a fair estimate of about 300,000 Chinese, mostly civilians, inside of the city. Okay? And if we go back to our idea of militarism from earlier, many of these soldiers who will carry out these atrocities will not be held accountable. Many of them will act many times without orders. And this is the military now becoming in many ways kind of untethered from civilian oversight. Okay. So a lot of these issues popping up, this explosion of violence against the Chinese, and we will see how that unfolds and ultimately culminating in this brutal event known as the Rape of Nanking / the Nanking Massacre. All right. So that's my video here. And take a look. I'll share you guys some resources, and we will sync up again on Monday. Okay? Bye-bye.